Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii. We are back with another really fun episode. Today, we're going to kind of have two main topics. And I want to get us started on the first one. I don't want a sneak preview to the second one yet. So with this first topic that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be thinking about how do we consider why other people behave the way they do versus how do we think about how we behave. And as you can probably imagine, there are some biases that we have and some errors that we may be prone to making. And so we'll dive right in. The first error that we are capable of making, which is almost, I would say, a default for a lot of people, it's the fundamental attribution error. And so the fundamental attribution error is all about how we decide why someone is behaving the way they are. And think about it from this perspective. So your coworker arrives late. What's your first thought as to why they arrived late? Is it because they tend to run late and they aren't paying attention to the time and they just lost track of time? Or is your first thought that, there must have been a whole bunch of traffic on their way to work, if you didn't hear from that? A lot of people would not think of traffic. They'd think of, my coworker lost track of their time. They're just late. This is a thing for them. They attribute this behavior, or in this case, this outcome, to internal factors of the other person. And that means that it very well could have been that there was traffic that was 5 miles stop, right? But we missed it. And so oftentimes with fundamental attribution error, in saying that someone else's actions are due to their internal state, their personality, so to speak, we can overlook a lot of really important contextual information. So next time your coworker is late, do not assume that it is because they are always late and it's their problem and it's their fault. Feel free to ask, was there some traffic? Or if you live in Boston, were there some wild turkeys in your way that wouldn't get out of the street?
I remember you telling me about that. I feel a little seen. I promise, Azaii, I was just making coffee. That's why I was running a little late this morning. No, but this is like, I taking a step back, like attribution is whenever you attribute an internal state to somebody else. Like they are lazy, or they are careless, or they don't care about your time, or they're really hardworking. And so going through this, like you can make some errors with this attribution. I want to kind of like pause and step back just for a little bit of a moment. We're going to talk about 3 terms here. And all of these terms are terms that I think that students inherently kind of understand, but it's the application of these terms that become problematic for students. And so this fundamental attribution error is the first one. The second one is a self-serving bias, which is whenever you interpret things in a way that is flattering to you, right? And so if I did well on a test, it's because I'm smart. If I did bad on a test, it's because my teacher is mean and stupid. Or like other people, like if I did well on a test and somebody else did well on a test, it's because I'm smart and they're lucky, right? Or if we both did bad, like they did bad because they didn't study and I did bad because I like just kind of got unlucky and like, so there were other factors going on here and it's not my fault. And so whenever you, apply your thinking to scenarios, like are you interpreting things in a way that is inherently flattering to you? A lot of people do this just all the time inherently. They kind of like see themselves as, kind of just for mental health, right? It's kind of, it's weird because too far in one way or too far in the other way, either way can be unhealthy, right? Like if everything is a self-serving bias and nothing is bad that ever happens is your fault, but everything good is all like because of you, that's not super healthy. But going in the opposite direction, away from a self-serving bias, like everything good that happens is like luck and everything bad that happens is because of you. Like that's also, I know some people who are like that. That is not self-serving bias. That's like anti-self-serving bias. But that's also like not super healthy. And so like learning to kind of like be, I want to say a realist, but also not going too far. That can be kind of a tightrope to walk.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I know we weren't initially planning on talking about it, but it makes me think of like a locus of control, right? People who have an internal locus of a greater internal locus of control and feeling like they have agency and control over their actions and what happens in their life versus someone who has a stronger external locus of control and life happens to them and they're kind of there along for the ride. And so what you're pointing out is so incredibly important, not just for the MCAT Psych Soc portion of the exam, but also just as you're studying, it's actually really important to have that balanced locus of control, that balance between self-serving bias versus what you're describing as anti-self-serving bias. And honestly, that needs to be its own term. You have officially coined it. Everyone who's listening, well, let's adopt this new term. But it's something that's incredibly important. And you know what we're talking about here in general today, similar to the last few episodes, are MCAT testable material, but also have a place in your own life. And I think that's what makes Psych Soc stand out in the MCAT, in that it's almost like a self-help section where you can learn things for your own improvement and self-analysis and whatnot. So hopefully that makes folks a little bit more interested in the psychology, sociology section. I almost said psychiatry, not that. But we've now talked about two different scenarios. So we have the fundamental attribution error where something happens with someone else and we say that it's because of who they are as a person, not because of external sources or factors. Then self-serving bias is focused on ourselves, right? And good, we did it. Bad, we didn't do it. It happened to us. The next one is the actor-observer bias. And the way I like to think of this is unlike the others, which primarily you hear one side of the story. With the actor-observer bias, you're accounting for both sides of the story. So the actor, the person who's doing something, who has some kind of behavior, is going to explain their behavior with respect to situational factors, right? So I showed up late and I'm saying that it's because there was a lot of traffic. It's not me. It's not that I'm lazy. It's not that I don't pay attention or am, a distracted person. But now it's not just considering what I have to say about the situation, but also the observer. So in this case, Phil, if I showed up, and I was not at all ready to record and I was like, give me 10 minutes. I don't have, which has definitely happened in the past. Let me set up my camera. Let me set up my mic. Then Phil's going to say, well, Azaii is never prepared. She's just not a prepared person. She is always, doing this, that. She has a problem. And so unlike the others, which were primarily focused on the interpretation by one person, with actor-observer bias, we have both coming into play, how the actor interprets the situation and how the observer interprets the information. And I think that can be really helpful to remember and identify, because this is something that when I was studying kind of sounded so similar to the rest of them. And I was like, what? How is this actually different? Like, how would I see this on the exam, right? And knowing that you've got both an actor and an observer involved in the description is which should lean you more towards actor-observer bias on the exam, should this kind of scenario come up.
Yeah. And that's really the key here, is that there's an actor and an observer, and they are interpreting things differently. And this is maybe what makes things even messier, is sometimes the actor and the observer could be the same person. Like when I do it, I view it one way, but when Azaii does it, I view it differently. So I view it one way when I'm the actor, and I view it one way when I'm the observer. That's also a little bit of an actor-observer bias. But this, I think the big, the reason this is difficult is because people want to look at these different terms and they want to think, well, if it's one of these, it's not one of the others, right? I always like to use the term of they think about these three terms as like cat, dog, and dolphin, right? And those, if something's a cat, it's not a dog. If something's a cat, it's not a dolphin, right? If it's a dolphin, it's not a dog. But really, you should be thinking about these terms as things like mammals or like swimmers or pets, right? Because I could find an example of something that is a pet and a swimmer, like a fish, a pet fish, right? Or something that's a mammal and a swimmer, like a dolphin. And so I can come up with examples that are all three of these, right? And so let's kind of like talk about that for a moment. So let's say I brought in cupcakes, but it's because my mom brought me cupcakes and like, there's too many and I can't eat them. And so I'm just bringing them in because like let's say I'm bringing them in because I want to be nice. Let's make it all three of these. And my coworker brings in cupcakes. And whenever they do it, I'm like, I think they're bringing in cupcakes because they're trying to gun for my promotion. And that's my promotion. And they're trying to get that instead of me. So when I'm going through this, what I'm doing is I'm attributing an internal state to that other person. I'm saying like they are being conniving and they're trying to get this promotion. And so that's fundamental attribution error. But also I'm doing this like I'm bringing cupcakes because I'm a nice guy and they're bringing cupcakes because they're like terrible. That is a very good, like that feels very good to me. That's a very self-serving way to interpret things that makes me feel better about myself. But I'm also viewing the scenario like one way if I'm bringing in cupcakes and one way if someone else is bringing in cupcakes. So there's an actor-observer bias in there as well. And so that one example is actually all three of these. And that's where this gets messy, is because very often students, when they come up with examples to these, the examples fit more than one category. And so they start to get kind of twisted and messed around. And so you can always think about like, okay, well, what would be an example of just one of these, but that's missing one. So like if I'm bringing in cupcakes because I just don't want to eat them and because somebody gave me too many cupcakes, but then my coworker brings in cupcakes and like, they're so nice and they're so kind to bring that in. Like that is an actor observer bias. Like when I do it, like it doesn't mean I'm a good person. When they do it, it means they're a good person. So that is an actor observer bias, but that's not a very self-serving way of looking at things. So that's not a self-serving bias. That might still be a fundamental attribution error if I'm making a mistake and let's say they are actually trying to gun for my job. And I'm like, oh, they're so nice bringing in cupcakes. And so I think that's where this gets messy. Like these three terms, I can't tell you how many times I get students ask me about specifically these three terms where they have an example and like, well, I thought this was actor-observer bias. And I'm like, it is. And they're like, but this says it's self-serving. And I'm like, it is. It's actually both of them. And that's why this can get a little bit tricky. So just to kind of like step back, fundamental attribution is when you're attributing something incorrectly to somebody else. Self-serving bias is interpreting things in a flattering way. Actor-observer is viewing something one way as an actor and one way as an observer, and interpreting things differently based on actor or observer overall.
And fundamentally, you can think of it as internal, right?
Yeah.
That comes before the external. I really quickly want to say that there's something else that you might have, if this is in a passage, you might have a related term, and that would be the Hawthorne effect, where there is an observer and the actor changes their behavior because they know they are being observed.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that is related, but is not at all discussing attributing behavior other than it has changed because there is an observer.
Yeah. Hawthorne effect happens a lot.
Yeah. All the time in life.
Yeah. That's why we have controls, is because when I have somebody in a study, they're going to change the way they act when they're in that study. And so like if I'm testing a weight loss pill and some people are getting the pill and some are getting the placebo, like if everyone's getting weighed every week, people are going to like skip the cheesecake just normally, just because they know they're getting weighed on Monday. And so like the behavior is changing. And so like if I just did my pill, I'd be like, oh, everyone's losing weight on my study, but they're losing weight because they're in the study and they're skipping like the cheesecake.
Another example, I don't know if you've either ever experienced this or if a family member expressed this. They have to go into the doctor and get some lab work done, maybe for their blood sugar, maybe for their cholesterol or something like that. And they say, okay, I'm going to eat really well the next 3 weeks, and then I'll do my blood work. I laugh and I'm like, I had this recently come up in conversation. And I said, you realize that if you do that, the results you're getting are not indicative of your actual health.
Right.
And so it's not going to give you useful information because that's not how you actually live. So yeah, it happens all of the time. It's, I would say, impossible to fully escape the Hawthorne effect. And whether we like to admit it or not, every single person has some element of this that kicks in. It's just human nature. But I figured I would bring it in just because if they're asking questions about these types of attribution error or self-serving bias, they could also ask a question about the Hawthorne effect, and it's worth knowing it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah. So, kind of next really exciting topic, and I think this might be the one I'm more interested for. We're going to be talking about morality, specifically Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of and theory of morality. So morality is one of those topics where you'd think that people would agree on what is right and wrong. But obviously, our world today says that is not the case. And there's one hotly contested topic after another, after another, after another. But what Kohlberg did was not look at individual topics, but rather how we approach and how we think about whether something is moral or not moral. I want to pause and say that he had some interesting views that I personally may not agree with. He did actually study at the University of Chicago, which I found interesting. That is also where I went for undergrad. But we can perhaps mention that when we get to it. So
I feel like with all the psychologists, especially in the 50s and earlier, like there's always like, okay, there's some great stuff here. I'm not on board with everything. I feel like that's just an ongoing theme with psychologists.
Absolutely.
So talking about this Kohlberg thing. So I do want to kind of clarify this a little bit. We've talked a lot about stages of development. Like we had kind of a series talking about Erikson's stages and Piaget and Freud's stages. And here we have another kind of thing where people go through stages. There's a kind of a difference with this. Kohlberg, the idea with these different stages is not that not everyone makes it through all these stages. Not everyone reaches the highest stages of ethical and moral thinking here. And so there's not at age 3 and age 7 and age 12, you're moving from one stage to the next, we kind of had in some of these other stages. Here, it's just generally you have to move through these stages. You have to go through this stage to get to the next one, but not everyone's going to get to the next one. And so there are 6 stages, but those 6 stages are actually broken up into 3 different, I want to say stages, that's not the right word, 3 different groupings, right? There's the pre-conventional, the conventional, and post-conventional. Each one has 2 stages in it. So the pre-conventional stage, or the pre-conventional grouping, has stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 is focused about punishments. Stage 2 is focused about rewards. And so all of this is talking about how do we decide what's the right thing to do, right? What is the thing that we should do in this scenario? So in this pre-conventional stage, everything's about rewards and punishments. So what's the right thing to do is whatever thing leads to the least punishment and the most rewards, that's the right thing to do, right? So if I kind of going through this, right? If I have been told, if I do this thing, I'm going to get spanked as a kid or yelled at or something, right? Threatened in some way, shape, or form, and I'm not going to do it. And that's the right thing to do is not to do this thing. Or if I am told I do this thing and I get a big pile of money, then if I'm in this pre-conventional stage or pre-conventional grouping, I'm going to be yeah, okay, that's the right thing for me to do. And that's what I should do in this scenario. Now, what's interesting is this doesn't care about what overall society thinks. This doesn't care about laws. This is just doing whatever leads to the most reward and the least punishments. And so this can lead to people in this pre-conventional can have, this can lead to a lot more criminality because okay, wait a minute, I go in and I steal this stuff and I get a bunch of money for it. That's the thing I should do because that's going to give me the most reward. And so you can have a component of criminality. I want to be kind of careful with this though. Because I'm not saying everyone in pre-conventional is a criminal or all criminals are in pre-conventional because that's not true. Then we'll talk about some examples outside of that. But basically this pre-conventional grouping is all just about punishments, reinforcements. I feel like this is something Skinner would love, like the whole behaviorist side of things. Maybe Skinner was in the pre-conventional stage is now how I'm going to be thinking about this afterwards. I want to asterisk that. That's not actually what I think, but I like the mental idea of that.
I'm inclined to agree with you on that. Yeah, I know that. So as anyone who has listened to our prior podcast episodes on stages, I like to have someone in my head that I can follow through. And so for the other ones, when there were ages, I liked to think about where someone was in school, because those are generally hard set ages, that you typically follow. For this, I like to think about just one person developing, assuming that they will get to the highest levels of morality, the highest stage of morality per Kohlberg. And for me, I find that helpful. So I think of little kids first, right? The first thing that they learn is, or one of the first words that you will hear kids learn to say is no or mine, right? So if they hear no a lot, they respond and will start saying no. That's because they picked up on punishment. And so I like to think of that as, that would be the first stage within this pre-conventional morality level. And then afterwards, they start realizing, I can get something, right? And so they start asking, I want this, I want that. Okay, behave. And when we leave, wherever we're at, then you can get something. Or what's a typical example? Like telling a little kid to behave when you're there out at a family meeting or a family gathering, and then telling them they can get McDonald's or something after, right?
Yeah.
That is that reward. So they learn to ask for those rewards. And so that's how I like to think about the progression through the pre-conventional morality level or stage.
Yeah, I like that, like thinking of little kids, because also the reason they say no is because you're telling them to do something that is generally unpleasant to them.
Yeah.
Like eating broccoli, like if they hate broccoli. And so they're going to be like, no, because they're trying to avoid that punishment of eating broccoli. And like, if you tell them like, I'll give you chocolate if you use the potty. And they're like, okay, I'm going to use the potty because that gets me chocolate. And that's what I want.
Exactly.
And so like all of their moral reasoning on like, what should I do and what should I not do is mostly just based on maximizing kind of pleasure in a way. So I don't want to stray too far into Freud, which is all about those things. But you should also like keep in mind, this can also be people outside of this. Yeah. And I know that I mentioned criminals. There are people who are in this pre-conventional who do not break the law because they know if they break the law, they might go to jail, and they're trying to avoid that punishment. So they are following all the laws, but they're doing it for a pre-conventional reasoning in that they are trying to like avoid that punishment.
Exactly. So now let's take our individual that we're going to be following through, and we will level them up to level 2, which is the conventional morality level with stages 3 and 4. And so before, it didn't matter what other people thought. But now this kid is in, or this person is in, let's say elementary, middle, leaning towards maybe the start of high school. And so, as we all know, what other people think matters a lot at this stage, right? So the first thing is kids want to fit in. They want to be liked by other kids, by their teachers. And so they want to come off and they're going to have good intentions. So they're going to behave in a way that is what society, what their peers, what their teachers would deem as good behavior. So now morality is not, am I going to get some kind of reward or am I going to get punished? It's, in a sense, will people like me, right? Am I doing what is considered good? And with that, right, people liking that. The emphasis being on, are they doing something that is considered good? That's the emphasis. But in my little example, that's how I justify this teenager doing what's considered good. As they move along, though, they realize that, there are some people that are in charge. And it's not just my parents that are in charge. Now, the teachers are very much in charge. The deans are in charge. The principals are in charge. And I have to do what they say, right? So I'm doing what's good, but now I also am doing what is told to me. And I'm going to be obedient to whatever the authority is. And so even if they might want to skip class, they don't, because they say, well, we were told not to skip class. So I'm sure there's a reason for it. I won't skip class. And that would be the conventional morality stage. I very briefly want to share what we learned before starting the podcast. Apparently, Kohlberg thought that women tended to stay in this third stage, the obedience stage. And I just want, in case anyone comes up on that in their own research, recognizing that there is a lot of societal push for that, and that is a very strong underpinning and reason why when Kohlberg was producing his theory, that would have been an observation.
Yeah.
It is this progression itself, though. The theory of the development of morality is a really solid theory.
Right. And I am with you on this. And like, it seems it's a little bit like, I don't know how much I want to kind of get behind this, because like saying women have trouble progressing in their moral reasoning is something I'm not on board with that really. But I can see that I do think generally there's a lot more pressure on women to conform and to go with something, versus like if a guy like kind of breaks the rules, he's the rebel, and that's somehow kind of good and sexy and interesting and like a cool guy. But if a girl's breaking all the rules, like kind of like, no, that's bad and not good. And so there's like this weird extra pressure on women. So I could see there's something perhaps there, but like still I don't think that there's an inherent thing with women that is harder. I think there's just more pressure on women to conform. And that's something that's a little bit trickier.
You just reminded me of a phrase in Spanish. It's calladita te ves más bonita. It literally means quiet, you look prettier.
Oh man, I hate that.
Now it's just like, oh Lord.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that my mom did not say that to me growing up, but you hear it so often. And so it's very much, it explains a lot of what perhaps Kohlberg was seeing.
Yeah.
But
especially in the 50s, 40s, like the ideal woman is someone who is demure and quiet and just goes with whatever the husband says. And I got some problems with that. Problems with the societal side of things. That's not a good thing overall. But the interesting thing, this second grouping or second kind of level in here of the conventional stage, I like the level term they're using, is this is called the conventional because that's actually where a lot of people end up. And they don't move to that post-conventional stage. Now you have to be really careful here because somebody who is following the laws, is that conventional or pre-conventional? Once again, I want to be clear. All of this, Kohlberg's staging of these things, looking at this, isn't based on the outcome. What are you doing? It's based on why. What are you thinking about? So if you say, I'm not breaking the laws because I don't want to go to jail, that's actually pre-conventional morality. Versus if you say, I'm not breaking the laws because you're supposed to follow the laws and they're the rules, so you follow the rules. That's more of a conventional morality. And so just saying someone doesn't break the laws, not enough to say that it's a conventional morality. And I say this because I think a lot of people, a lot of students, when they see following laws, they're going to say conventional morality. And the MCAT writers know this. And so if I was going to try to write a tricky question about Kohlberg stages, that is the question I would write. About this person following the laws because they don't want to go to jail. That's pre-conventional. That's not conventional. And so you have to be very, very clear and careful with these because the stages of them are kind of tricky. And it's more about why rather than the actual actions themselves. So as you move past, the level of conventional, you can go to post-conventional. And not everyone gets here, but this is the highest grouping or highest level of morality where you start to recognize, so stage 5, which is looking at understanding there's a difference between moral and legal rights. What is the right thing to do isn't just based on following the rules and going with what everyone says. And then stage 6 goes into this very abstract morality and understanding social contracts. And this is something that's actually kind of complicated overall and maybe is worth breaking down social contracts just for a moment. But Social contracts are contracts that you have entered into and you are a part of without actually like signing a contract. Just as being a part of society, you are going into like there's some contracts that we're in. Like for example, examples are always the best way to talk about anything like weird and abstract and confusing, right? So I pay my taxes. I never signed a form that said I'm going to pay this much money like every year to the government, right? But I understand that like this is something I want to like pay money to the government so that they can protect the society and like have a police force and a fire department, and I need roads and like libraries are good, and like so there's this contract that like I'm expecting the government to do these things, and in return I'm like paying taxes. I never signed a contract on this, but it's just part of being in a society. There's this social contract. You can also have social contracts between people, right? Like if I do like I'm going to act a certain way because I expect other people to act similarly, right? Like I don't steal stuff from other people because I don't want that's not a good world to be in where everyone steals from everyone all the time. And so I don't steal because I understand that's how a society should work. And so I'm acting this way in this kind of more abstract morality of understanding how the world should work and how it should be. Not how it is, not what the rules are, not what's best for me, because it's best for me if I steal stuff and nobody else does. But like that would be the best financially for me. But like this is just what society should be and should get to. This post-conventional morality is like a much higher order, and it's kind of difficult to go into. But I think an interesting thing here is, like I mentioned that pre-conventional can often lead to criminality. So can post-conventional, where you realize the right thing to do might be to break the laws, right? Like if you, like let's say that you, there's something going on that you are protesting. And so you go and do sit-ins at stores to kind of protest like civil rights movements. Like what's going on in society is not okay. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to break laws peacefully, but like I'm still going to break laws and like do sit-ins and do marches and things like that. And it's not best for me, right? Because I might get thrown in jail or get hit with a baton or something. But this is like, it's the right thing to do morally, right? Going through that. Also thinking about kind of like that stage 6, this abstract social contract stuff. So Henry David Thoreau, the person who wrote Walden, I think it's his most famous book. He also had a thing that he wrote called Civil Disobedience. And he went to jail because he didn't pay taxes. And specifically, he was not paying taxes because he thought that the government was not doing the right things. And so he's like, listen, I'm in this social contract with you. I'm paying taxes, but you're not doing the right thing. You're not upholding your side of this. So I'm going to quit paying taxes. He ended up going to jail for this. And so this is a great example of this like abstract post-conventional morality of doing things not necessarily against the law, but just like doing things because it's the right or wrong thing to do and not caring about if it's the thing that I'm supposed to do, what society tells me I'm supposed to do, or what the actual legal rules are, or just even unwritten rules.
Yeah, and I know we had talked about it. This opens, so first my mind went into game theory when you started talking about, it benefits you, doesn't benefit someone else. With this last level of post-conventional morality, thinking about someone who is, and again, just following the one person example. So the way I think about this is someone who is protecting another kid at school and throws the first punch, right? Because they're protecting someone else. That would be breaking a rule, but they're trying to defend someone else. And so they've decided that what is considered moral, what is considered good, is to break a rule. And then, like you said, that last one with the societal contracts, that one is just more abstract. And so doesn't quite apply to the example that I've been using. But I think it's important to recognize, like you said, that the main thing when it comes to the MCAT is understanding the reason for doing something. The classic dilemma that is often used to think about morality, there are a few, one being the pulley, right? But
Trolley problem is a big one.
the trolley problem. So you have someone is there's one person tied to one set of tracks, two people or however many people on another set of tracks. So either way, someone is going to die. You pull the pulley or the lever to decide which team or which people. But there's another one that has to do with stealing that is quite applicable to this theory of morality. And I just learned that it's called the Heinz dilemma. I did not know that there was a name for it before. And so imagine a scenario where someone, their spouse is dying and they need some medication. And the medication is available and it costs $50 to produce the medication. But the pharmacist or whoever it is that is selling the medication is selling it for, instead of $50, $5,000. And you can't afford it. The question becomes, what do you do? And how would you respond depending on which stage of moral development you're in? So in multiple of those stages, the end result will be stealing, but for different reasons. And so you could have someone steal in the pre-conventional stage because there is a reward. You could have someone who doesn't steal it because there is a punishment. So both actions can be attributed to pre-conventional depending on the reason.
Right.
And the same thing for conventional and post-conventional.
Yeah, that's super interesting that in that pre-conventional, like, it could go either way. If you say, I'm not going to steal this because I don't want to go to jail, that's a pre-conventional morality. If you say, I'm going to steal this because I want it and, like, I want to sell it for money, and, like, in that case, stealing it and not stealing it, both could be pre-conventional. What matters is your thought process on. Now, conventional is pretty cut and dry.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to steal it because it's, like, you don't break the rules. Like, you go with the rules, you do what you're supposed to do. The post-conventional, that's something that can be a little bit tricky. So, like, you could go in and steal this stuff and give it to your spouse who is sick. And like, making this a little bit morally gray, I always like to kind of twist the dilemma into, like, let's say it's a pain medication and it's just making them feel better. It's not curing them, but, like, it might be the right thing morally to steal this and make it so that they're not experiencing as much pain, that their quality of life is increased. And so, but, like, that could be the right thing to do in that, versus, like, a post-conventional person could also say, like, listen, I'm going to wait until the store opens and I'm going to go and plead my case, because I understand that, like, living in a society where everyone steals is not a great place to be in, and people should act in a certain way. And so I'm going to, like, hope and plan that this pharmacist will understand and will be able to kind of, like, go through that. So in that scenario, you could also get stealing versus not stealing, which could both be post-conventional, which is why this is confusing. So you don't want to tie these reasoning to a certain action, right? But you want to tie them to some thought process going through this. And I kind of want to take a second and just, like, that conventional, like, the more I think about it, there could be a scenario where you still steal it that is a conventional morality, but not the obedience one. The obedience one says you follow the rules, but in the good behavior one, where you're going with what does society say is the right thing to do. Like, if all of your friends and all of society says you should definitely steal this, like, you should go get that and give it to your wife, and that's the right thing to do. Like, you might go and do it, not because you think it's the right thing to do, but because that's what everyone in society says, and so you're just going with society. And so I guess technically in all of these different stages or all these different levels, you could go one way or the other. You could steal or not steal, but it's really about the reasoning behind these things.
Yeah, because this can be so confusing, I'd encourage you to remember one or two words for each of these stages and then look for something that would represent that word on testing. So, for example, pre-conventional, right? Stage 1, punishment. Stage 2, reward. For conventional, stage 3, good behavior.
Good in quotes, like, as viewed by society.
Yeah, exactly.
Not good as in morality. Right.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I realized that people who are listening would not see my quotes.
Yeah.
After that is obedience, right? So these are just one or two words that you can remember. Then after that is moral versus legal. And after that, you can either think abstract or social contracts. I think social contracts might make more sense because those, I would say that post-conventional in general can be a bit more abstract.
Yeah.
And essentially, this is a sidebar, not MCAT testable, but palliative care is a giant post-conventional morality field. So for anyone who's not familiar with palliative care, it's essentially making someone with a chronic illness or someone who may be dying comfortable. So a lot of times if someone has a chronic illness that, is incredibly difficult to manage with pain medications, we might get palliative care involved so that they can help us weigh the benefits and risks of giving, for example, additional opiates, knowing that opiates can cause a lot of other symptoms and, discomfort and whatnot, but it's this pro and con. And it's almost like this, right? It's not legal versus moral, but it's, do we give something that will make someone comfortable? It's like that pain medication analogy that you said. Instead of stealing, it's do we give it knowing that there's this risk versus do we hold it but have them continue in pain, right? Yeah. So it's not a perfect analogy, but it is really similar that you'll see these things as you continue in your career, not just with respect to stealing. Stealing is just the easiest one to visualize.
Yeah, and it's a little bit unfortunate that the post-conventional one can also lead to a lot of problems. Yeah. Because that is the highest level of morality, but that means that you're not just going with the rules. And that can, every physician that I know of has been in scenarios where they're like, this rule is stupid. And like, this is impeding my ability to care for this patient. That happens all the time. But like navigating that can be very, very difficult. And something that a student, you guys will run into when you become a physician. I do want to say for stage 3, instead of saying good, I think it might like go with popular, right? Just like if you're looking for one word, good is good with like the quotation marks. But like, it's like, what does society say overall? But like, it is technically good behavior, which I think is actually the term that he used in there is like good, quote unquote. But yeah, so hopefully this clarifies things. These are some really tricky topics that we talked about today. And I want you guys to be thinking, how are they going to test these? Because I want to be honest, a lot of students go through these terms and they're like, yeah, I understand these, I'm good. And then they come to a question and they're like, whoa, this is not just asking you for the definition. This is asking you to apply these things. So the like fundamental attribution error, self-serving bias, actor-observer stuff, I think all the definitions are pretty straightforward, but when you start to apply them to scenarios, it can get weird and twisted and messy. And the same thing with Kohlberg, because a lot of times people like go through this, like there's a set example that's given and they just like memorize the example and the definition, they're good. But the Kohlberg stuff is about how to think, which is different than just memorizing these definitions. So hopefully that clarifies things, makes it a little bit easier for you going forward as a physician, as well as on the MCAT. I think about the Kohlberg stages more often than I probably need to. In the real world, somebody says something and I'm like, I like what you're saying, but I don't like your thought process, because that is very clearly a conventional morality reasoning or pre-conventional. And I'm like, okay, let's get to a different way of looking at this. So hopefully that clarifies things, and be thinking about how the MCAT's going to ask you about these terms, because the MCAT can be very tricky.